I'm John Bowen. I teach anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. Well, diversity is a fact. Societies are diverse in the extent that they have people of different ethnic, racial, religious, etc. backgrounds. Pluralism is more of a perspective on that, whether those differences are respected, whether the diversity is seen as something positive or negative, and that's where societies are more or less pluralistic. I think the most important factor for inclusion is a sense that everybody shares something. So if you share a language, then you feel you're part of a language community. If you feel that the language is a property of some other group, then you feel excluded. So Indonesia, for example, and I'll draw on that example as that's where I've done many, many years of work. Everyone speaks Indonesian more or less as a second language. The demographically and politically dominant group, the Javanese, are particularly poor at speaking Indonesian. So it doesn't make people feel inferior if they don't speak that. That's one factor, a common language. A second, and I could list many, a second would be a sense of some sort of common purpose, some common history, or in particular, some common struggle. So Indonesia is a country where everybody participated in some way or another in the struggle for independence against the Dutch. In fact, in the panorama of Indonesian heroes are included people who fought alongside the Dutch, but they're considered to have participated in the struggle against the Dutch. Everyone's included. Other societies have not had that experience of struggle, so they don't have that common memory to fall back on. I think one of the greatest obstacles is when all the differences line up. If your group is or sees itself as economically worse off, politically non-represented or underrepresented, with no particular cultural assets vis-a-vis the rest of the people. However, if everybody feels like they have a piece of the pie, they might have the best literature, or they might be in the army, or they might feel that they're the most sophisticated religiously, or something like that. If everybody has some area where they figure they're on top, or at least they're respected for what they do, then you're much less likely to have conflict. Well, I'll take the example of Indonesia again. I speak from that which I know something about. Indonesians have, most of them, this sense of having participated in the struggle for independence between 1945 and 1950. Let me take two examples, though, that show where that works and where that doesn't work. The two most extreme, geographically, parts of Indonesia are Aceh on the far west, where I've done many years of work, and Papua, which is physically part of the island of New Guinea on the far east. Well, Aceh sees itself as having participated in the revolutionary struggle because even though the Dutch never came back to invade Aceh, Aceh had an airplane. They bought it in Malaysia, they used it to fly people around in Malaysia, they used the proceeds to contribute to the revolutionary cause. Even though Aceh has been in a state of guerrilla warfare, separatism, or whatnot since most of those years since independence, nonetheless, all that while they celebrated their glorious past history of contributing to the revolution. And that's one of the reasons why when the Achenese War was finally settled about 10 years ago now, Achenese could have something to fall back on, a sense of being part of Indonesia. And indeed, they participated in national elections and local elections, and integration with the rest of the country is fine in Aceh, despite its history of dissidence. Papua New Guinea doesn't have that history. They weren't part of Indonesia during the struggle. They're only part of Indonesia because there was a referendum, probably not carried out in a very honest and fair and open way, that concluded that Papua wanted to integrate with Indonesia, and indeed in the 60s they became part of Indonesia. But there's always been a strong sense that we're not really accepted. We don't really have any part in the history of this country. We don't really belong. They also look differently. They're racially darker than most of the other Indonesians. But that main difference is there's a sense in the case of Aceh, or not a sense in the case of Papua, as having had some part in nation building. So let me go back to the example of Aceh. It's a good one. The Achenese are very proud of being a separate province. Indeed, they have a status of a special area. They alone among Indonesian districts or provinces have the right to reform their legal system along the lines of Sharia. So they have they're a kind of a religious special case. So their distinctiveness is certainly respected vis-a-vis the rest of the country. But as I said, they do have this strong sense of having been part of the nation of Indonesia. Their quarrel in the past has been with particular governments, not with the notion of nationhood. So yeah, you can combine those. As long as there's something that is superordinate. You might think of yourself as very separate, very special, very distinct from everybody else, and that might be respected. But as long as there's something along that allows you to feel part of the larger whole, then you can be part of a sense of a nation. That's the problem with Belgium. The Flemish and the Walloons, the French speakers, have very little they can look back on that really unites them as one people, one struggle, that sort of thing. Now, let me actually answer those in reverse order. And the question is well put. It has to do with the political mobilization of differences. And here I would say the political mobilizations of difference, whether they be ethnic or religious or something else, racial, for example. Because we often have the false idea that people who are religiously or ethnically or racially different are always in a state of suspicion, of opposition, or of conflict with each other. It's just not the case. If you look around the world, most of the time, people who are distinguished along these lines live together reasonably well. They trade, they intermarry, they go to the same schools, etc., even though they have a difference, right? It's not special to Canada or Europe. It's true in most of the world. Why does conflict erupt, and why does it look like it's ethnic conflict or religious-based conflict? It's usually because there's some competition for resources, where two of the competitors happen to be different along religious or racial or ethnic lines. And so then they each mobilize their followers. So then it becomes a massive conflict of people who are Muslim versus Hindu, or one ethnic group versus another, Hutu versus Tutsi, etc. Of course, some of this goes back to colonial manipulation, as in the Rwandan case. So in general, I think looking for the political mobilization that's behind what we often miscode as ethnic or religious or racial conflict is important. Now, is religion a special case? That was the first question. I think sometimes it isn't. When we're talking about political mobilization, it's not. But I think it is special in the following way. Religion involves a certain degree of commitment or belief or faith in something that can't just be given out by the government. It's not just a competition for resources, it's something else. Ethnic and racial identities really don't. I might consider myself to be of a certain ethnicity. It's not something that I'm going to live or die for unless something else is the case, but I might want to live or die for my religious faith if I'm a strong believer. And so that can make it more susceptible to even stronger and more violent mobilization than the mere fact of ethnic or racial difference.